Hi everyone, welcome to part two of lecture two. This second part is going to kind of give us a very brief tour of the history of how society has viewed this population. In general, we kind of break this in to these five different sections. This information isn't necessarily in your text explicitly, and certainly for exams and such, my goal isn't for you guys to remember certain dates and remember the names of everything, but just get an understanding of where we've been, where we are now with society's view of this population, because it helps us know how we can make things better, what we're doing well, and help us, just do better when we're working with this population. So we're going to get into this here. So the first time period is known as antiquity. And again, the treatment of this population really differed across different cultures and individuals. In some cultures, individuals with disabilities, and specifically cognitive or intellectual disabilities, were viewed as angelic, and others were demonic. Mild intellectual disability, so those kind of right on the margin, were generally not recognized. Services were custodial in nature, so you just kind of had to take care of the individuals. And then at the beginning of the Renaissance, that's really what helped us lay the groundwork for later changes. So this next time period, or emergence and early disillusionment, goes from the 1700s to right before the 1900s. So at this point, humanistic philosophies like everyone should be treated equally, people should take care of those that are less fortunate, really laid the groundwork here for establishing how we view this population. And we have some really important people that really were early pioneers in special education that changed the way that we looked at this population, really started to embrace them. So Itard was someone, if you guys have ever heard, he worked with a wild boy, essentially, who was deaf and mute. And he believed that he could teach them, he could teach this boy to learn, and he successfully did. And then Sagan opened the first school for children with special education, the first person to open a school that provided special education services for people with disabilities in France. Some American pioneers that you've probably heard of: Dorothea Dix. She was a huge advocate for underprivileged and oppressed individuals. Samuel Howe had the first public training facility, so first public school in the US that treated individuals that needed special education needs, and then Wilbur established the first private one. And so then what happened during this time period? So there was this real sense of hope, like everything would be fine. People with disabilities, specifically cognitive or intellectual disabilities, could be integrated into society. There were these huge grandiose claims that were probably a little, might have been a little far-fetched in some ways, and that we could cure intellectual disability. And this just was due to a huge lack of understanding of intellectual disability. And as we know, it's a developmental disability. And while things get better, we certainly can't cure it. So then what kind of happened was that things didn't go so well because we can't cure it. So people kind of went back to old ways. And so what happened then is there was this shift from teaching and instruction, and the expectations were probably way too high, and there weren't enough services to accommodate. And then we moved back to this time of caretaking and warehousing. And then we look at the facilities-based orientation and kind of what happened there. And that went from about 1890 to 1960. And there were a lot of really important contributing factors during this time period. The first is the eugenics scare, and we'll talk a lot about that. And that had a huge impact on how society viewed this population. And additionally, there was a large influx of immigrants, and people were really scared. And there kind of this mass hysteria broke out that there were all of these people coming from different countries that weren't as cognitively savvy maybe as we were. And then this is also when the mental tests or cognitive testing or IQ testing happened. And a lot of that information, unfortunately, ended up being misused. So the eugenics scare, this was a scientific movement essentially to improve the human race by manipulated breeding. It was based on the works of Darwin and Galton. And the thing was to breed out intellectual disability. So you will see that at its worst, it led to the sterilization and sterilization laws of individuals with disabilities, specifically intellectual disabilities. And this eugenic scare situation came from the Kallikak family. And there was this study that was published by Goddard in 1912. And the central theme that was that feeble-mindedness, which what they were referring to was intellectual disability, was inherited. So, and we'll learn a little bit later that that's generally not the case in general. There are some inherited factors or different for certain genetic disorders that can lead to intellectual disability, but absolutely it's not passed down from generation to generation. And this movement led to this whole the menace of feeble-mindedness that was taking over society. And you'll see in just a second that Goddard's research on this was actually called into question. So the eugenic scare led to sterilization laws in 26 states in the 1900s. People opposed these things and brought it to court, but the constitutionality of these laws was upheld in the famous case of Buck v. Bell. And Justice Oliver Holmes wrote in his majority opinion that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And again, he was referring to individuals with intellectual disabilities. Additionally, there was lots of immigration. I'm going to move this just a tad. During this time period, there was also immigration from the early 1900s from Eastern Europe. And again, what Goddard conducted in another study was that these groups of individuals were linked to this feeble-mindedness. So this kind of mass hysteria broke out, being really scared of immigrants and having them come to our country, because the thought was that they were going to bring intellectual disability to the United States. Additionally, the mental testing movement, which is again the IQ or testing movement, happened. It began with Stanford Binet, just Binet and Simone in France. And the original purpose, the main purpose was it was meant to help benefit students who needed special education services to better have an understanding of what they needed educationally. But Binet himself expressed a fear that this information this test might be misused. And we discovered that that was absolutely the case. Again, all right. So the test was translated into English and used here, and the Army was actually the first place that really used it. And what happened was many soldiers were identified as having intellectual disability, and so this test allowed for the identification of people with mild intellectual disability for the first time. And this again fed that hysteria that intellectual disability was this widespread phenomenon that was taking over. And what you'll start to really understand, especially in our next lecture when we talk about cognitive assessment and how these tools are made, when we look at the first test that was made by Binet, the test, again, wasn't really well constructed. So what you derived from this test was kind of this mental age, and that's currently not how we derive it. So it wasn't that Binet did something wrong, but his current understanding of how you might calculate an IQ score wasn't spot on. So what it did is it over-identified people as having cognitive difficulties when in fact they didn't. But that information, again, really scared people that there was this huge phenomenon of intellectual disability that was taking over the country and that we kind of had to get rid of those individuals and stop it from spreading. So just some related socio-political influences, because it's always important to understand these just to kind of see how people are embracing or maybe not embracing a certain population. The end of World War I meant that there were a lot of veterans that were coming home, and the Great Depression led people to, have a lot of neediness, and this really fostered a lot of empathy for people with disadvantaged circumstances, including those with intellectual disability. There was a lot of prosperity following World War II, and this led to these feel-good times, and then a lot of social programs that supported people with disabilities thrived, and this sense of optimism as though we can help and make things better and embrace this population really returned. During this time period, there's some really important pieces of legislation. The Vocational Rehabilitation Act provided employment training for people with all types of disabilities, so not just those with intellectual disability. The Cooperative Research Act provided money for research that we could focus specifically on individuals with intellectual disability and making things better. And then there also, Public Law 85-926 offered incentives to encourage teachers to go into special education. Really, really important, the Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education, which actually was that case. It didn't have to specifically do with individuals with intellectual disability, but it was the desegregation case that said that separate was not equal. And what this really did is it laid the groundwork for policymakers to think a little bit differently. So Brown v. Board of Education had to do with race, but it had to do with separate not being equal. And so what you allow for one population or the majority, you also have to extend those same rights to the minority populations, including individuals with disabilities. So that really is a really important piece of case law that lays the groundwork for even current legislation with special education, and making sure that that population has equal access to education and services as the same opportunities as people that without disabilities have. Move this again. Ooh, move it down here. Okay. So some socio-political forces, science and research, and again, we're back at the eugenics situation. So in the 1930s, Harold Skeels questioned the notion that IQ was this fixed or constant thing, so this state-like thing. Remember, we talked about that in the first lecture. And the science of genetics moved away from models that previously bred such alarm or hysteria. And reviews of studies, such as the Kallikak family, found a lot of methodological flaws. So essentially the data was faked and it wasn't true. And if you kind of just pause for a second to think about something else in similar history where this has happened, specifically with the autism and vaccine research, when all of that was those Wakefield studies that were called into question, it's since been determined that there were huge methodological flaws, and that research is not considered valid. And specifically with the eugenics stuff, when all of those methodological flaws were called into question, there were subsequent studies that were conducted and very different and more hopeful results were found. All right, so now we're going to move into the services-based orientation. So the 60s up until about 1985. And so what I'm going to do now is we're going to watch a little video about just to really show what was happening at this time and what led to a lot of these changes and moved more into this services-based orientation. This clip features the lovely Geraldo Rivera and his fantastic mustache. So I'm going to pause now here and go back to full screen so you guys can watch this.
Hi everyone, I'm Geraldo Rivera, and this is my friend Bernard Carabello. And aside from the fact that we're both Latins from Manhattan with mustaches, Bernard and I share something else in common. Half a lifetime ago, back in January 1972, our paths crossed inside a horrible institution for the mentally retarded called the Willowbrook State School on Staten Island. At the time, the largest institution for the retarded in the world. And despite the fact that it was in New York City, it was also one of the worst. Bernard had just turned 21 years old. He had just, when I met him, forced authorities in the institution to sign him out of that wretched place in which he had spent the last 18 years of his life, inside Willowbrook, since the age of 3. He had wasted those years inside that awful place. It was the tragic result of Bernard's being incorrectly diagnosed as mentally retarded, though his actual condition is cerebral palsy. There is nothing wrong with Bernard's brain. But in those dark days, folks, as you probably know far better than I do, the institution, all institutions of its type, were giant catch-alls, kind of warehouses for children with all different kinds of ailments or conditions. If a kid wasn't perfect, places like Willowbrook existed, where they could be sent out of sight, maybe out of mind, certainly out of the house, out of the neighborhood, and out from under the feet of those parents and families. Over the long years since the first Willowbrook exposés, I have learned not to blame parents for what was happening to their children back then. The institution was just what society in those days felt the best alternative for people with developmental disabilities, kind of a theoretically benign warehouse where their care could be mass produced and they could live out their almost certainly shortened lives. That system went along benefiting from a conspiracy, I think, of silence, a conspiracy of silence among the states, the families, the staffs of the various institutions, and the media for decades. Then in the 1960s, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, whose own sister Rosemary, as you recall, was retarded, visited Willowbrook as the senator from the great state of New York. Senator Kennedy was appalled by the horrifying conditions he saw. He called it at the time a snake pit. But still, the boys, the girls, the men and women inside, the inmates of Willowbrook, languished in conditions that were more reminiscent of a concentration camp or a kennel than a hospital. Before I go any further, for the benefit of the younger members of our audience, I'd like you to see what they saw back in 1972. What they saw that forced them really to deal with the situation they were looking at. Let's flash back 33 years.
Well, I visited the state institutions for the mentally retarded, and I think particularly at Willowbrook that we have a situation that borders on a snake pit, and that the children live in filth.
I first heard of this big place with the pretty sounding name because of a call I received from a member of the Willowbrook staff, Dr. Michael Wilkins. The doctor told me he'd just been fired because he'd been urging parents with children in one of the buildings, building number 6, to organize so they could more effectively demand improved conditions for their children. The doctor invited me to see the conditions he was talking about, so unannounced and unexpected by the school administration, we toured building number 6. The doctor had warned me that it would be bad. It was horrible. This is what it looked like. This is what it sounded like, but how can I tell you about the way it smelled? It smelled of filth, it smelled of disease, and it smelled of death. How long have you been at Willowbrook?
18 years.
How long were you given physical therapy in school?
5 years.
Are you still going to school?
No.
Why?
I'm over age.
You're too old?
Yes.
Would you like to go back to school?
Yes, I do.
What would you want to learn if you went back to school?
Learn up my reading more.
Learn how to read?
Yeah.
How is it living on the ward that you live?
Disgrace.
Is it disgrace?
Yes.
Why?
The conditions are getting worse every time they cut the budget more and more.
The Willowbrook story and the years of television follow-ups ultimately had a profound impact on the way society cares for the developmentally disabled, as you know. Not just because the old way was horrible, but also because humane, progressive alternatives existed, for example, in the form of community care, one-to-one housing, and other non-institutional models. And in selecting which was most appropriate, the most articulate advocates turned out to be the consumers themselves. That's what Bernard, in fact, does right now for a living. He works for the state of New York, keeping those politicians honest. So, buddy, first of all, how are you doing?
Okay. Great.
Who are the best advocates for the developmentally disabled?
The parents and the consumers themselves.
Parents and consumers themselves. Why is that?
Because they know what they want. And they know what they need from themselves. And now they know how to make choices.
How to make choices. And the choices available far more humane, progressive than they were in your day.
Oh, yes. And they get more and more progressive.
So life's good.
Yes.
All right.
Great.
Thank you. So just as Willowbrook took more than government action alone to fix, full inclusion of people with disabilities within society must come as a result of the continued action of brave individuals like Bernard, people who don't let their disability stand in their way. What's also profoundly necessary is that they get the protection and advocacy efforts of agencies and organizations like your superb National Disability Rights Network. We salute you for the work you do. You are the future, and we're glad to be part of your evening tonight. For Bernard and me, thanks very much for listening.
All right, guys. So what you got to see there was an example of many things that were going on during at the beginning of this time period that really led to this huge move towards improving services for individuals with intellectual disability. So that's just, again, highlights another reason you can kind of take that, think about that again, and really, again, illustrates the importance of understanding how this population has been treated, so that we can continue to make things better. All right, so during the services-based orientation, the philosophy and practices really looked at successful integration. This could possibly include self-contained classrooms, so having a separate location for individuals with intellectual disabilities, pull-out educational programs where they just are pulled out for a little bit, or sheltered workshops in which they could be trained to be employed. And at this time, the nature versus nurture debate gave way to the idea that both forces interact. So not only does a person's biological makeup contribute to possible disability, but also the environment, or the amount of nurture. I guess it's not the amount of nurture, but rather the environment, the role that plays in the expression of disability. Pieces of legislation that were important: the Civil Rights Act of 1964, again, huge piece of legislation that laid the groundwork for future reform for people with disabilities. Vocation Rehabilitation Act Amendment of 1973, this includes Section 504, which we'll talk about later. Section 504 Services Act essentially as a Bill of Right for people with disabilities and allow them access. Public Law 94-142, huge landmark case that said that kids with disabilities or students with disabilities have a right to a free, appropriate public education, just like their non-disabled peers. Some litigation, the Park case. This specifically established the right to a free, appropriate public education, or FAPE, for all children with intellectual disabilities. And then in the Mill case, extended the right to education for all children with disabilities, not just intellectual disabilities. All right, and so now we find ourselves in the supports-based orientation. And again, this makes sense if you're thinking about what you've read about so far. And the first lecture when we talked about the whole understanding within that multidimensional framework is looking at how supports can make things better for people with disabilities, understanding those 5 areas of human functioning and what roles supports can play to help maximize human functioning. So since 1985, there's been a struggling way. We want to continue to reinvent the way that people with intellectual disabilities are thought about and the way they're treated. In general, academics and in the field of academia and disability studies, this has been really well embraced, but it still can be cautiously approached by service providers and the public, including education. Part of the reason that this has a huge piece that has really helped us is the changing of the definition. And we talked about that in lecture 1, how the definition has changed from mental retardation to intellectual disability when we're talking about this population. Important to point out, though, is that when the term changed, the population didn't. So it wasn't like certain people aren't covered, that were covered under the label of mental retardation. It refers to the exact same group of people, but I want you guys to think about why the term has changed and why it's important for it to change, and what the changing of the term does for the way that people maybe embrace or maybe still don't embrace this population. Oh, of to note, there are in general fewer people diagnosed with intellectual disability than it was previously, but that also has to do with early intervention, which we'll talk a lot more about in subsequent lectures, then a better understanding of what is and is not. As you saw with Bernard, he actually had cerebral palsy, had no intellectual disability at all, but he was misdiagnosed just because we had a lack of understanding of what constituted that population. The American with Disabilities Act, really, really important. In 1990, this really looks to provide civil rights protections and the same opportunities for individuals with disabilities as their non-disabled peers. This covers both private and public sectors. It impacts everything from employment, public services, transportation, telecommunication, and public accommodations. The development of the Disabilities Assistance and Bill of Rights Act of 1994, this really looked at making sure services were designed for optimal outcomes, so for actually making things better. It just didn't have to do with just giving them something, making sure that the goal was in mind for making things better or as good as they can be for their non-disabled peers. And additionally, making sure that services occur in the least restrictive environment, which means making sure to the greatest extent possible they're still with their non-disabled peers. So the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, it really assured that a free, appropriate public education, or FAPE, is available for all. It looked at making sure that they have appropriate evaluations, that individual education plans, or IEPs, are developed and followed, that an individual's education occurs in the least restrictive environment, making sure that parents and the child are participate in the planning of this to the greatest extent possible, and that there are procedural safeguards that are in place, so certain rights that you have as a product of having an IEP. No Child Left Behind, which is now the Every Student Succeeds Act. This really, again, had high standards for all people. It was a pretty lofty goal, but it said that all students should be performing at grade level. Again, this has since been changed to the Every Student Succeed Act, but it's important because this included people with intellectual disabilities as well. It said that they could have accommodations and alternative assessment options, but that they were included in this all. The Olmstead Act really helped to make sure that people with intellectual disabilities were placed appropriately in their communities and that they were allowed community services, including living and leisure activities, and making sure that the wishes of the people that have an intellectual disability, their opinions were taken into account, and really that person-centered planning was used, and this whole idea of self-determination, and which is, again, really is a huge focus of current research and work with people with disabilities, making sure people have control over their lives and have some choices over where they're placed. The Atkins decision in 2002 said that we could no longer execute people with intellectual disabilities, even if they were convicted of capital crimes. In the third module of the semester, we're going to talk a lot more about this. All right, and so ending up, I'm going to encourage you guys to watch this YouTube video. It's a little bit longer, so I'm going to let you guys watch it at your leisure. But I want you to think, based on this very quick tour of history that we just had, how Loretta's life might be different across all of these different time periods, and even what could we do now to make her life better. She's an individual with an intellectual disability, and she gives an amazing TED Talk, so please watch it, and hopefully it will inspire some things you could talk about in a discussion post to start, and really making sure, again, though, with those discussion posts, if you use this, that you're using direct evidence from the reading and references that are assigned for this week that go along with the lecture. And I think that's it for now. So thank you guys again for your attention. Let me know if you have any questions.